Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to today's session. My name is Bernardo Enchev, your host and the president of AIMS International and the managing partner for AIMS International USA. AIMS International continues to add valuable insights through its team of experts to help our clients and prospects navigate successfully through the challenges of our era. We have the team and the resources available to empower you through these challenging times. Our leadership development experts are available from over 50 international markets and diverse sectors to listen, understand, design, and implement customized best practices to scale up your business. Today, we are delighted to see many partners, clients, and friends joining us from different geographical markets, and we are looking forward to continuing our conversation with all of you. So I would like to start by thanking you all and our panelists for joining our webinar on this hot topic, the new dynamics in Asia, the current business dynamic and talent strategies. And I would like to introduce to you my dear colleague, Roger Cater. He's the Global Life Sciences Head in AIMS International, and also our panelists who are subject matters in their fields, and above all, they are action takers. After our speakers are done, Roger will conduct a 15-minute Q&A session for those who are interested in interact with our panelists. You can type your questions anytime through the chat. Our first speaker is Phee-Wah. Phee-Wah is the founder and the CEO of Hacker Life Sciences, with more than 27 years of experience in the C-suite advisory and consulting positions, with a deep understanding of the Asian market and the record success in landing companies in the region. Our second panelist today is Louise Phua. Louise is the regional director for AIMS Singapore, and she has 20 years of experience in multinational executive search organizations. She is deeply familiar with talent acquisition and talent management in Asia. So thank you guys for joining us today. And I would like to invite Phee-Wah to start the presentation.
Right, thank you. Thank you very much. So good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are. This is a truly international community then. So my presentation is basically broken up into 4 parts, and the introduction of Asia Pacific, life sciences in China and ASEAN, and a little bit of COVID and summary. But I think this is where the main points will be, that why it makes sense to engage in life sciences in China and ASEAN and Singapore as a hub. So Asia Pacific is, well, you know, as the name implies, is countries in Asia who have access to the Pacific Ocean, and this is the Pacific Ocean, of course. And then you can see the countries on the left, listed on the left, right? And then Australia, New Zealand, right at the bottom, right? And it turns out that in Asia Pacific, these countries is 2.3 billion people, which is about 30% of the world's global population. And it turns out that by coincidence, it's also 30% of the world's GDP. Right. The other point that I want to just raise up is that India, the Indian subcontinent, South Asia, they are not directly linked to the Asia Pacific Ocean. But I just want to raise them here because it's a lot of people. It's about 1.8 billion people and basically 23% of the global population. So Asia Pacific is a very, very diverse series, a very diverse region. And so what I've done is that to help ourselves do an analysis, I have broken it down into developed and developing countries by per capita income. And you can see that in China, ASEAN, and India, it's kind of like the developing countries of Asia Pacific. And on the left-hand side, you see that these 3 regions together, they actually comprise 45% of the global population and 24% of the GDP. but I would ask that perhaps it is more suitable to concentrate on these regions, right? China and ASEAN. And the reason I say that is because China and ASEAN represents kind of like the middle class of Asia Pacific, right? And it is probably a better fit to the life science organization or the community that we come from, right? But in addition to the Asia Pacific countries, I would like to also mention the South China Sea geographically, right? This is the South China Sea here, and it is the second most used sea lane in the world, right? The other point that I would like to raise is also the Straits of Malacca, which is here in this part here. And roughly about 94,000 vessels pass through these straits every year, right? And then let me introduce you to Singapore, the little red dot, also known as the red dot, where Louise and I are based, right? So it is the second world's largest, the busiest port by tonnage. And the reason I mention this is because I just want to highlight the point that Asia, ASEAN and China, of course, we have our self-propelled growth, but we also play a critical part in the global logistics and economy. And in this space, excuse me, then Singapore is a nice place to be a hub, to set up a hub, right? So Singapore as a hub is not only a logistic hub, it's also a hub to the life science community, right? And in Singapore, there's a lot of life sciences make up of the pharma, the medical device, and the biosciences as well, and over several functions, right? I will just pick up an example, the pharma example, the pharmaceutical example. So of the global top 10 pharma companies, 8 of them have manufacturing facilities in Singapore. And of the top 10 pharma products, 4 are produced in Singapore, right? So Singapore actually has a population of roughly about 5.8 million people. So obviously no one sets up manufacturing facility to serve 5.8 million people. So these guys have set up basically to serve a global market. And that is an important point, right? But in terms of, in addition to manufacturing and operations, Singapore also has an innovation, it's also an innovation hub. And in this study by KPMG, Singapore is listed as the most innovative of hub in Asia, right? And it is also a good place where there are many unicorns. But I would also like to point out that it's not only the unicorns and the small company startups that is doing well in Singapore. There's the big guys are also here, and they are also doing something very, very innovative, like stream farming. And in this case, it's actually already taking place in Indonesia, Vietnam, and Singapore, right? So it's not just a concept, but they're actually rolling out and executing their strategy now, right? So now, please let me introduce you to 2 gentlemen. The first gentleman is James Lim. Right, James Lim is the head of AP, Asia Pacific head of Becton Dickinson, with a global revenue of roughly about $20 billion, right? And in this photograph, he's actually receiving an award from the President of Singapore, right? And for Skills Future, which is developing your employees. And in Singapore, Becton Dickinson has an operational office, a regional office. So China and India and ASEAN reports into James. And James is also leading 2 manufacturing facilities. So I took the opportunity to ask James, so why would someone like you, BD, set up an operation in Singapore, right? And he says that firstly, there's IP protection in Singapore. So when the company brings their technology to Singapore, it's effectively bringing their family jewels, to Singapore, because that's where, patented intellectual property is. So the companies feel confident that this will be protected, right? So after you bring the technology in and then you make your products, and because there's been government to government negotiation, countries in ASEAN and China, once they learn that your product has been made in Singapore and now imported into the country, their regulatory authorities are actually prepared to reduce the timeline for you to commercialize your products and make your products available to the users, right? And the third point is also that there's a lot of infrastructure and the logistic support in Singapore, and it is voted as the most effective logistic hub in Asia, right? And another point is that the last point from James is that the Singapore government is a very, very pro-business, has a very pro-business approach. And in this year, they have basically set aside almost $3 billion in support of the health, biomedical science innovation in Singapore, right? So all this obviously is not free or not charged. So the next question I asked James is that, so what does the Singapore ask for return? So the Singapore government asks for that you bring innovation to Singapore, that this technology is not easily replaced by a low-cost country, right? And it doesn't leave Singapore after 2 years and all that. And obviously, it has to serve the global market because Singapore market is just too small, right? And secondly, the Singapore government is obviously very, very keen that for investors to invest in Singapore, to build facilities, to create jobs, and in this case, actually to have continuous learning of their employees, because they are very, very conscious that countries like China and Vietnam, they are right behind us, right? And anything we do today, there's nothing to prevent them, to stop them from being able to do that tomorrow, right? So it's always a continuous learning cycle, right? The second gentleman I would like to introduce to you is Benoit. Benoit is a functional lead of an Asian medical device company, right, where the global sales is roughly about US $5.5 billion. And he's a functional lead responsible for these functions. And Benoit has roughly about 30 years international experience, including in China and Japan. So I asked Benoit the same question, right? So why would you guys want to set up a Asia Pacific HQ in Singapore? And these are the 5 reasons that Benoit listed out, right? Easy access, low corruption. Actually, I need to get back to Benoit actually, because I'm very curious why he said low corruption as opposed to no corruption, right? So I'm sure the Singapore government will be very curious as to the reason why he said low corruption, yeah. And then good infrastructure, talents, and the Singapore government has a very pro-business mindset as well. So the second question is the same second question, which is that what is your cautionary comment about working in Singapore? So he has 3, and one of them is that he's a little bit concerned about rising costs, right? Especially with payroll and basically talent people. And then his next point is that, okay, how would I mitigate that and how do I address this issue? So basically he said, well, firstly in Singapore, Louise will also comment on this, the labor market is actually quite free and open, and there are low taxes, both personal tax and corporate tax. So his comment was, just be very good at what you do, yeah. So just be efficient and effective and use your innovative technology, right? So his second comment is also that you're not here in Singapore to serve Singapore. You're here in Singapore to serve Asia Pacific. It is a very diverse and regional market, right? So his point is that it is very important to make sure that you get the right people to lead and to execute and to operate, right? And his third point is that the Singapore government is very, very pro-business, but they have a slight bias and slant to support the local people. But they are open. They're open, and as long as you meet the two criteria, which is to innovation and invest in Singapore, they are open to negotiation. Right. So there is the feedback from Benoit. Benoit's feedback was actually 3 pages. So what I've done is I've actually condensed that into 1 page. Right. So if I may, what I would do is I would also like to add my comment in addition to James and Benoit. So my first comment would be that the rule of law, because because Asia Pacific is very, very diverse. So you have Singapore, and then which is where the rule of law is very, very similar to the so-called Western world, the US and the UK and European rules. And then you have China, which is developing, and Cambodia, which you could probably describe as emerging country, right? So the manager will need to manage in this environment. Right? The second point is that Singapore is actually a melting pot. So when I put this presentation together, it struck me that James is actually a Singaporean, and he runs Asia Pacific for an American company listed on the New York Exchange, right? But Benoit is actually Belgium, and he is the functional lead of a Japanese medical device company, right, in Singapore. So in Singapore, it doesn't really matter where you are and where you come from. Is the fit to the needs, right? And that's tends to be the recurring theme in Singapore. And lastly, I would say that there's a lot of support from the Chamber of Commerce and the embassies of the respective countries. Previously, I was chair of the healthcare committee of the American Chamber of Commerce, and I used to be on the board of governors. And we were also making sure that we organize things and help in this case, the American companies, the life science companies who are coming to Singapore, right? So why is Singapore a good place to start a hub? So James and Benoit has already made comments, and there's no need for us to repeat what they say. But I do want to make one point, which they didn't raise, and that is that Singapore has a very good access to China and ASEAN. So you can see that the flight time from Singapore to Shanghai is less than 5 hours. And then to Vietnam and to Indonesia is 2 hours, right? And then the time difference between us and them is at the maximum 1 hour. Singapore is 1 hour ahead of Vietnam and Indonesia, right? And then with this time frame, you are basically have access to 2.1 billion people, 21% of the global GDP, and roughly growing at 5% as a group, right? And all within 5 hours and 1 hour time difference, right? So it's relatively easy to do business, so to speak. Yeah. So this, I'd like to comment, let's say 2020, right? That is the first year after the COVID broke. So the COVID broke at the end of 2019, and 2020 was the first full year when the impact of COVID was felt, right? So China grew at just slightly more than 2%. The previous year, 2019, China grew at 5.9%. So they came down from roughly 6% to 2%. But all the other Asian countries contracted, right? In the first quarter of this year, the World Bank has actually made a forecast that China will grow at roughly about 5.1%. And the ASEAN region, on a weighted basis, will grow at roughly about 4.8. Excuse me, right? And actually, it depends on who you talk to. At that time in the first quarter, the Chinese themselves actually felt that they would grow at roughly about 5.5. So it's a range between 5 to 5.5, right? But I would ask, this is really unfortunate, because in the last month, Hong Kong and 22 other Chinese cities, we have a lockdown situation. Shanghai is probably the most severe, And then in the other countries, there's a various degree of lockdown. And this has definitely impacted the economy, right? Especially the logistic part of Shanghai, right? Excuse me, yeah. Okay, so this is something to be wary of, right? So I guess it's a sign of the times that I would like to set aside one page to talk about COVID. And I guess the question that we want to raise is that, is it safe for me in Asia in respect to COVID? And how would I work in this environment? So in Asia, basically the strategy to address COVID is actually two extremes. There are two extreme strategy. In China, it is a zero COVID strategy, which is that if I find there's a breakout of COVID in one case, I will shut down the area, whether it's an office building, or a school, and no one from that building or school can come out, and obviously no one can go in, and I will shut it down until the individual recovers from the disease, right? So in Singapore is kind of the opposite. So the strategy, the thinking is that it's an endemic, right? At some point in time, you will need to live with COVID. So we are going to vaccine as many people as possible, everybody if we can, so that we get immunization and then we get to live with COVID, right? But whichever strategy you talk about, the outcome is actually very good for both China and ASEAN, right? So you can see the global, and you can see China, you can see ASEAN, right? But in particularly for Singapore, because I'm here in Singapore, this is the vaccination rate. So the vaccination is the key to the Singapore strategy. So eligible population, meaning those people those eligible are people from 5 onwards, right? So those people who are not eligible for vaccine are those people less than 5 years old, and those people who have allergy to vaccination, to the vaccine, right? And of this group, 96% are fully vaccinated, right? And you can see that the government continues to spend a lot of money. This year, they will spend about almost $4.5 billion on COVID-related cases, right? So Louise and I are very happy because since last week, the restrictions has been dropped, right? So we have an option not to wear a mask now whenever we are outdoors. And I think it was yesterday, that restaurants now have no more restrictions. It used to be restricted to 5 persons for each outing, but now there's no restriction. So you can have a party of 10, you can have a party of 50 or 100 now. So there's a fantastic lifting of restrictions for us. And that is based on the outcome of these outcomes. Right. So in summary, if you can just let me summarize, after 2 years, I think we are ready to look for recovery, right? But the problem is that now with the Shanghai lockdown, the current discussion now is that the forecast for China now is roughly about 4 to 4.5%, as opposed to 5.1%. So the jury is still out. No one knows for sure. It's like 6 weeks after the Shanghai shutdown. So people are still formulating their forecast. Right? But ASEAN and China, we are both intertwined. If you are standing from the China perspective, ASEAN is the largest both importer and exporter into China, right? So ASEAN is China's largest trading partner, right? So in Singapore now, there is the restrictions are lifted. So no vaccination. If you are a foreigner, right? If you can show that you are vaccinated, then there's no quarantine, right? So as a hub, this is a very, very important point. So like, for example, James, right? He would have his colleagues from the US fly into Singapore. So they will fly into Singapore, arrive in Singapore, sleep overnight, and then the next morning, basically they can go to the office and have a meeting starting at 9 a.m. and then meet the customers and go out on a field trip, not only in Singapore, but in the region as well, right? As opposed to countries like in China, you can't even go in, and then you have to be quarantined for 21 days, right? So it's only on the 22nd day, then you can start to do business, right? So that is quite impractical, obviously, right? So on the last point is that there are actually a lot of helping hands available. So you've got people like James and Benoit who is very, very happy to share their thoughts and all that. And then there's a Chamber of Commerce, and then there's government agencies. If you have a good value proposition, and as you said, as I said previously, is innovation, and then you invest in Singapore, they will go out and help you as much, right? And then of course there's Louise and I, right? So I hope my discussion has been helpful. Thank you very much for listening. We hope you can have some Q&A and then try to address your concern, right? And on that note, let me pass it to Louise, who can make a commentary on the HR issues in Singapore. Over to you, Louise. Yeah.
Thank you, Phee-Wah. Hello, everyone. I am Louise Phua, and I'm based in the AIMS Singapore office. I'm here today to share with you a snapshot of talent in Asia. And as Phee-Wah has said earlier, Asia is large and diverse. Therefore, in a few short minutes, I can only share with you some highlights that we have researched recently. So next. So in terms of the diversity, Singapore is a very good example of what we have in Asia. Being a small country with 5.45 million people, 3.99 million people are citizens and permanent residents, and 22% are non-residents, meaning they are foreigners who are working or living here. And in our population, about 74% are ethnic Chinese, mostly second or third generation born locally like myself, or they could be Malay or Indonesian heritage, or they could be about almost 9% of Indian ethnicity. And we also have a mix of others here among us. Next. Whereas elsewhere in other parts of Asia, such as Vietnam, Korea, and Japan, the population is largely homogeneous with one dominant ethnic group. So Singapore is quite diverse. So we have always maintained a multicultural society with multi-language, multi-religion, and we are a true melting pot. And in terms of the foreign workforce here in Singapore, we now have about 1.2 million foreigners working among us. Any foreigner who wish to work here must have a valid work pass or a work visa approved by the Singapore government before she or he starts work. The Singapore MOM, or Ministry of Manpower, has come up with 4 categories of work passes, which encompasses about 21 types, and they cater to entrepreneurs, professionals, skilled and unskilled workers, as well as students and interns. And for those foreigners who are here with families or trailing spouses, they are required to apply for long-term social visit passes as well. In other Asian countries, there are different requirements and restrictions. So do reach out to myself or my colleagues in the respective country if you'd like to know more. We have officers and colleagues in China, Japan, South Korea, Vietnam, Malaysia, and India. I'm not sure if I miss out anyone else. Okay. In terms of educational attainment, Singapore is on par with the developed countries. Therefore, Australia, New Zealand, US, and UK, we are quite similar in terms of the percentage or the proportion of adult population that have attained a bachelor degree from a recognized university. For Singapore, as of last year, about 32% of our adult population holds tertiary education. Elsewhere in Asia, is also growing very fast. In Indonesia, Philippines, and Thailand, they are also expanding very quickly. Now, on this chart, this is derived from UNESCO last year. The figure for China is somewhat unusual because this is related to the year 2010, and during that year, China's figure was 3.6. As of last year, the number have changed quite significantly. I received an article from Nikkei newspaper last week that China has about 10 million fresh college graduates last year. So the qualified workforce as a whole in Asia is really expanding. For Singapore, we have always invested heavily in our educational sector. Today, Singapore has about 5 universities, 4 polytechnics, and about 20 private institutions. And all these institutions also have industry partnerships with foreign and local companies in life sciences, such as Bayer, Dyson, and Nestle, just to name a few. On top of that, in recent years, the Singapore government has expanded the investments in adult education. So Skills Future is a new initiative that came out perhaps say 5 years ago to cater to the working adults. This is a scheme that is intended to nurture a culture of lifelong learning among the working adults. So every citizen, and as well as companies that's operating in Singapore, can reach out to a variety of subsidies and grants, employment opportunities, and career advice from the Skills Future Board. I also like to talk a little bit about STEM, and women in STEM has received a lot of attention in recent years. STEM stands for Science, Technology, Engineering, and Maths, and this is something that's somewhat familiar for many of us in the life science sector. 2 notable women scientists that I like to bring up are Dr. Sumya Swaminathan. She is a pediatrician from India with 30 years of experience in clinical care and research. Dr. Sumya is the first chief scientist that is named by the World Health Organization in 2019. Another notable scientist is Du Youyou. Du Youyou is a Chinese chemist, and she received a Nobel Prize in 2015 for a breakthrough in a plant-based therapy against malaria. Now, malaria is a disease that is related to a particular type of mosquito. And for many years, there has been no breakthrough in this particular treatment. Du Youyou has discovered a plant-based method, and this therapy has benefited millions of patients in South China, Southeast Asia, as well as parts of Africa. And that's why she received this award. So I like to emphasize that the Asian governments are taking action and taking notes of women in the STEM sector. In this slide, I like to also make some comments about the level of safety in some of the key Asian countries. This is a survey done by the World Population Review. And in this review, Qatar is ranked the safest country in the world among 137 countries. So Qatar has 12.13 criminal cases per 100,000 people last year. That's why it is ranked the lowest. So the lower your ranking, the lower the crime rate. Other Asian countries with low ranking include Taiwan at 135, South Korea at 117, Singapore at 114, and China at 109. I also like to comment that with the pandemic, the crime scene has also changed. In Singapore, over the last 2 years, we noticed a significant increase in cybercrime. There has been scams and hacking in a variety of internet platforms such as Facebook and WhatsApp. But the government is taking note. So as we speak, there's a lot of new laws and new regulations that's being introduced to protect the interests of genuine sellers and genuine buyers over the internet. Next. Some comments about China today. I have worked in China and lived there from year 2006 to 2013. I have personally witnessed how China has grown from strength to strength since her open door policy in 1980. As of today, China still wants to maintain an open door policy with regards to foreign businesses and foreign investors. However, with the pandemic, we do see some restrictions in terms of entering and leaving the country. However, we believe this is short-term and temporary. That would change when we have a better hold of the coronavirus. There is still fairly strong centralization. The central government based in Beijing drives most of the legal framework across the country. There is also fairly strong control over information. So companies such as Facebook and Google have exited the Chinese market because they were not able to adapt their business model in China. But we also see some success stories. Microsoft and Bill Gates are growing very robustly in China over the last 20 years. Now, environmental issue is something that many governments are taking note of. So is the Chinese government. In the last 20 years, many of the polluting and heavy industry have moved out of the large cities away from residential areas. Many of the factories are also required to implement additional devices or gadgets to minimize the pollutants into the environment. Demographic issues is something that is also of concern. With the aging population, there is more people who will be entering their golden years. So if you have services or products that's catering to the aging population, you could be having more business in China as well. I encountered an American wheelchair company called InvaCare. It is a privately owned company that has a plant in Suzhou, which is outside of Shanghai. So when InvaCare first went into Suzhou, the intention is to manufacture premium wheelchairs to export to America. However, over the last 10 years, InvaCare has been receiving quite a lot of inquiries from the Chinese market. So today, InvaCare is the factory in Suzhou in particular is making products not just for the US market that was the original intention, is also producing for the Chinese market. Over the last 20 years, we also witness the expansion of the middle class in China. There is better quality of life generally. More people are having hobbies. And one very obvious hobbies is how is 190 million households keeping pets, particularly cats and dogs. So this is definitely a booming business for if you have an animal health business. Another area to note is there is more charity and philanthropy among the Chinese businesses. So if you have the element in your business, it is always good to raise this when you market yourself in this market. Degree of adaptation is something for every business to consider when you come into China. Next slide, please.
I'm sorry, I seem to be stuck here.
Degree of adaptation.
Right. Okay.
So whether your business is new in Asia or you are already operating here, you would like to consider the degree of adaptation of your business and your work culture, how much, whether you transplant 100% of everything from the home country to the local country, or do you cater and adapt to the local culture. At AIMS, we'll be happy to help you step forward. So on that note, as I wrapped up this presentation, I like to share a saying by Confucius. Confucius is a sage and a Chinese philosopher. For many centuries, his teachings have influenced many generations of Chinese and Asians. His teachings are deeply rooted in our political structures, our way of life, and our daily practices. So among his many words of wisdom, this particular one is about the man who moves a mountain begins by carrying away small stones. And therefore, my question to the audience is, if you are preparing to do business in Asia, have you already started carrying away the small stones? And have you also encountered some bigger rocks that you would like us to assist you with? On that note, we thank you and we welcome your questions in the next segment.
Thank you, Phee-Wah, and thank you, Louise. Really interesting. We have we've got 15 minutes left for questions, and we have a number that have been put forward. So what I'll do is go through them chronologically and then hand them out to the person that's got probably the most experience to answer them. The first one is to do specifically with life science. And the question is, which growth areas in life science do you see taking place within Asia-Pac, and which would be the most profitable?
Right. If I can try at this, I think broadly speaking, I would say that recently digitalization is a very, very interesting angle, because the reason is because suddenly it's easy to get data, and it's easy to analyze data, maybe through machine learning, etc., and artificial intelligence, and then to store and to transfer data. So how this has transferred out is that there's now a much larger form of telemedicine, for example, right? So there's a lot of, so people are asking remote medicine, practicing medicine remote. So there's also a possibility that there's a need for remote diagnostic devices, right? So I personally feel that is one angle, right? So on your traditional angles like pharmaceutical, medical device, molecular, there will always be a market there, and it all depends on where your fit is and where your contribution is. As Benoit said, you just have to be very good at what you do and you find your fit, right? But on top of that, I would say digitalization could be one possibility.
Any comments from yourself, Louise?
Yeah, earlier I mentioned about the aging population. So anything related to the elderly sector is growing quite fast, not just in China, but Malaysia and Singapore as well. I personally have witnessed more community hospitals that's being opened. There's also more demand for a variety of services and products related to that. The other one is aesthetics. Aesthetics in Singapore has grown about, I think, more than 20% over the last 10 years. We see more aestheticians and beauty-related products, particularly with the middle class that's been expanding. Also, animal health, not just basic animal health, but premium kind of animal health services. We witness more pet owners who want better quality product. I have been seeing advertisements for organic pet food, which did not come into this market maybe 5 years ago.
On that point, Louise, what about, we're talking about pets here, cats, dogs, etc. But what about the bigger beasts, the beef, the cows, the pigs, the porcine side? Is that a growth area with an increasing population?
Yes, certainly. For agricultural countries such as Thailand, Malaysia, China, there is definitely demand for this, and also for premium products as well. I believe Jonathan has previously worked with a client called compo experts. They are expanding very quickly in Asia. The other one is, although for Singapore, with a small country and very little agricultural sector, with the pandemic, many governments are refocusing on the agricultural sector currently. So I think it was last year that the Singapore government announced that we want to be self-sufficient by 30% in terms of our food supply. Likewise for China as well as the other Asian countries. In Singapore, we are seeing some trends such as food safety as well as reducing food waste. So, food science that's related to these sectors are going to be growing quite well here also.
Thank you, Louise. The question that came in was, if we had to list the 3 major benefits of to a company transferring to Asia Pac and setting up their headquarters there, what would they be in order of priority? Phee-Wah?
I would say, I think number 1 is access to the market, like, in terms of time and in terms of time difference, for example, and also supply chain. So if you had your facilities here in Singapore, for example, then you can access, 27% of the global population, within 5 hours to fly, right, and 1 hour time difference. So there's access, right. In the case of Singapore, for example, and in many ASEAN countries, the government is very, very supportive, right? Because the government sees these life sciences as an opportunity, a growth opportunity, right? Because it is a unique, and it relates to everybody, because it is health, right? Everybody wants better health for the population. And then, and it is a very unique technology. Like the Singapore government says that if you bring innovation here, then it's very difficult for other people to replicate your technology, right? And this is the place to be, right? And I think the last reason is that the population as a whole is growing. So spending and knowledge, like for example, Louise has just raised an example on pets, right? So I did actually a study on some pets because the population in China, people don't want to have children anymore. They 1 child, 2 child, and that's it. And some couples actually decide to have pets instead. But then the pet become a family member. So whatever you spend on a family member, these guys are willing to spend on their pet, right? So the money you spend on the baby, this guy is, I wouldn't call it a surrogate child, but it's basically the mentality is that I'm prepared to spend to get the return. Right, so that was a very, very interesting study, and by the time we present it, you can imagine how excited the party is, right? So lifestyle, and these 2 other, I think they are the opportunity for us.
Phee-Wah. Louise, any comments?
No additional comments. I agree with what Phee-Wah said. The changing lifestyle, and I see, because I live in Paris for about a year, I see some of the Western lifestyle that's becoming more obvious in many of the big Asian cities. I remember in Paris, about 30% of the household have pets and no children. That is also replicated in some of the Asian cities already.
And what about the costs associated with the talent pool? We've heard that Singapore is a great place in terms of a hub and close to other countries, but we've also heard that the cost of living in Singapore is quite high, and the cost of recruiting talent is high. Would you care to comment on that, both of you, starting with Phee-Wah? Right.
So let's do the talent pool first, the cost of talent pool here. I would say that the talent pool in Singapore is a free market. There's no constraint, right? So the Singapore government, they are of course under political pressure to protect jobs for Singaporeans, but by and large, they are driven by economics, right? So if like for example, James, right, in BD, a lot of the guys on the factory floor are actually from Malaysia. right? Because they are willing to accept. And then they used to drive over to ride a motorbike to Singapore and then ride back, you know. So they earn salary in Singapore, but they spend in Malaysia, right? So that is a free market. You can argue that there's a free market here in Singapore, right? As far as the labor thing is concerned. I think the challenge that like Benoit is very concerned about is that everybody is growing, everybody is building, and everybody. So, and then the market is a very diverse market. You need a certain unique people who are very agile. In fact, that's exactly what Benoit said. You need agility in the people, right? And then you can't do like, oh, back home, you know, this is how we do it. And then you go to Cambodia, and then you need to, you know, create something and all that. And you need someone who is very agile and willing to do new things. And those talent are actually quite difficult to find, right? Anywhere in the world, it's not only Asia, right? Yeah. So I think that is the issue here, right? My last comment on cost of living here is that, well, the tax rate in Singapore is actually one of the lowest in the world. Yeah, and you must appreciate that Singapore is a city-state, so it's actually smaller than Greater London, right? And you know, so in terms of rent, in terms of cost of living, you have to compare city versus city, right? But if you are talking about owning a home, then you know, it's a different discussion. That is definitely more expensive in Singapore, right? Yeah. And on a personal basis, alcohol and smoking is definitely very expensive in Singapore. Right, yeah.
Any comments, Louise?
Yeah, so is cars. So if you don't own a
yeah,
car, you don't
sorry, I
smoke,
forgot that.
you
Yes,
don't
yeah.
drink, I think it's quite bearable. We hear a lot of grievances about the cost of talent. I would say that Singapore talent is good value for money. Why do I say that? Because many of the Singapore workforce, we are quite well trained and we work very efficiently. I also hear of clients who so-called restructure and outsource part of the business processes to a lower cost country. And then, you know, after they make that decision and they transplanted teams of people to other countries, they express a lot of regret because the results and the performance really pale in comparison. So the cost saving they thought they could have from, you know, a cheaper workforce did not materialize because the cheaper workforce then have to, you know, incur more time to do the same piece of work or to do the same piece of work over and over again because there were mistakes. So then I would argue that the Singapore workforce is very good value for money. But you got to be also quite strategic what you choose to keep in your Singapore offices and your operations. There are some recurring transactional type of work that truly would be better off in certain low-cost countries. I cannot deny that. Also because of, as Phee-Wah mentioned earlier, the ease of travel and the time zone and the access to the Greater Asia market, the Singapore passport can access all these countries very quickly and very easily, which is not always the case for other Asian passports.
Yes, on that point, Phee-Wah, you mentioned, it's interesting, you mentioned that some of the countries, particularly Singapore and China, are intertwined. But what about India? I'm thinking of Delhi and Tokyo, Japan. Is it true to say, although they're within Asia Pacific generally, they indeed are big enough to be standalone to a great extent with their own hubs?
Yes, of course, definitely. But mentally, I think they are not thinking of themselves as hubs. They are more of, I can make this, I can build a factory here, and I can make this, and I can export. In India and Japan, as you know, they make cars and all these guys, electronic things. So their mentality is this. right? Whereas Singapore, we have no land, and at that time we have no people and all that. We just need to be a hub, a transaction hub, a transshipment hub. Yeah.
So Phee-Wah, you're basically saying that they work, at least India and Japan would work on an integrated basis, developing their own economy, as opposed to using the hub concept and then spreading it out, as Louise was saying, into manufacturing, for instance, into low-cost countries adjacent to Singapore.
Right, yeah. And Singapore really didn't have a choice. We just have to be very good at, being a hub is one opportunity, and we just wanted to be very good at it.
Yeah. How are your costs in Asia Pac within Singapore relative to, for instance, Japan or India?
Labor costs, or generally speaking?
No, labor costs in particular.
Yeah. Louise, do you want to go first, or?
I would draw on reports from Mercer if we want to do that kind of comparison, but I don't have that data with me right now.
Yeah. Maybe I can make a comment, right? So in Singapore, a lot of the need is basically for regional people with regional skills, right? And then a lot of supply chain skills, regulatory, and regional sales and marketing, right? Whereas I think in Japan, when they have a lot of factories, they're looking more like for engineers, right? So, and in Singapore, the agility is very, very important. So in a way, you're looking for different skill set, right? So that's why it may not be so straightforward to compare an engineer in Japan versus a regulatory guy in Singapore, based in Singapore, right? Because the regulatory guy will need to register the products in Singapore and in China and in Cambodia. So that skill set is actually quite unique.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And in fact, presumably the English language is more widely spoken in Singapore than, for instance, Japan.
Correct. Yeah. So that's a good point. Yeah. I think I would say that English is essentially universal in Singapore, right? So from the most basic, actually at the local coffee shop, to the most sophisticated in the boardroom. So English is used, right? Whereas, during my time in China, there's only a certain band of people who speaks English. And as a foreigner in China, I really should immerse myself and speak Chinese rather than speak English. Yeah.
And I'm not quite sure which of you would like to take this first, but my understanding is that if you want to set up business in China, you have a local Chinese on your board. Is that correct, Phee-Wah?
Yes, more for operational basis rather than a strict requirement, right? So and you can ask a friend to be a symbolic kind of a model, right? And you can work through him, but it is not. But you can be the key person behind it. Right. Yeah. But there are a lot of such people in China. It's quite easy to set up, people, and they understand the opportunity, the entrepreneur opportunity. It's just that to the entrepreneur, it's just one more step for you to do.
Louise, do you have any comment?
Yes. So Phee-Wah is quite right, and also there's again different cities and different provinces may have new adjustment. Hong Kong is relatively easy, I would say. So depending on where you want to set up your new entity, we also have our China offices that can help us with this.
Yeah. And in terms of moving forward, do you see the larger growth taking place in Singapore as opposed to China, or China as opposed to Singapore? I'm thinking of all the issues that China has right now, with obviously COVID, which presumably they will overcome, but all the other issues connected with, the stuff going on within Ukraine, within the US, and the political conflict there.
If I could just go first, yeah. So To me, I think China with 1.4 billion people and a very strong momentum, I think it's a market that you need to participate in, you need to engage in, right? Or at least think it through very, very clearly, because it is very big and I think it's very, very promising, right? If you really feel that there's no fit, then I suggest that you think it through first and do the math and come to that conclusion first, as opposed to just dismissing it, right?
Yeah.
Personally, I think that needs to be done, right? In fact, I would say that at some point in time, if not today, in 3 years' time, 5 years' time, you should have a position in China.
Yeah. Louise?
Yes, I think having worked and lived in China for a few years, China is a place where business leaders need to be extra patient. Things don't happen the way it does in your home country, and therefore, the patience is an important factor. If you are in a hurry to break even by the end of your first year of operation, good luck to you. It doesn't always happen. If it does, you really have very good luck that year. Not to say it doesn't. I have also seen pharmaceutical company that grew at 28%, but that is after investing for a good 20 years or so. More often than not, I think perhaps 60% of MNC that go into China, they would need a few years, to really understand the people and their practices before they can have good business.
Absolutely.
So it's a long range game. It's not a quick win.
Okay. So on that note, it's 2:00 and we've got to finish, but I'd like to thank both our speakers for speaking so eloquently about their subject matter. And for
Pleasure.
and all our audience for attending, and thank you for that and also your questions. I'd just like to leave you now for the next minute. If you could take time to watch the newly created AIMS International Life Science video, which explains who we are, what we do, and how we do it. Thank you for your time.
Okay, let me know when you start seeing my screen.
The future is in the hands of the youth, of those who seek answers, of the compassionate, and of those working to feed future generations. We understand the complexities of the sector and its regulations. That's why we offer high-quality support in executive search and talent management and leadership development consulting in all segments of life sciences. We are a team of physicians, board directors, and functional leaders from the life sciences sector and can support your company in more than 50 countries. We deliver boutique-style quality customer service on a global scale within the following life sciences segments: pharmaceuticals, RX and generic, biotechnology, medical devices, diagnostics, agrosciences, animal health, consumer health, equipment and instrumentation, medical supplies. We work in close partnership with our clients, sharing knowledge and advising on the optimal solution for their business. Our global footprint enables us to support our clients in any country and manage all projects from a single point of contact. The future is in our hands. Let's work together. AIMS Life Sciences. Your business is our business, and our business is life sciences and healthcare.
Thank you all. Afternoon, evening, or morning, wherever you are.
Thank you.
Right.
Thank you for
See you.
coming.
Bye. Yeah.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
See you all.